Hello, hello. May I ask you all to sit? That would be so kind of you. Thank you. How very lovely to see you all. I'm delighted to welcome you to the John Carter Brown Library. I'm Karen Wolf, and I have the honor to serve as the director and librarian of the JCB. We are also so happy to have you with us, not just here in the Macmillan Reading Room, but also lots of friends and colleagues and family joining us online from all around the world. This hybrid programming is essential to the JCB's commitment both to welcome and also to accessibility. I want to extend a special welcome to current and former JCB fellows who are joining us, especially those who are here with us remotely. I also want to thank the staff here at the JCB who've been particularly helpful in bringing this event together, in particular Michelle Carrero and Kate Goldman. Thank you very much. As well, of course, as our colleagues in facilities management and media services. The Bromsen Lecture is funded by a gift from the late Maury Bromsen. A longtime friend to the JCB and a generous benefactor, Mr. Bromsen was both a dealer in rare books and other materials, and also a collector himself, particularly specializing in early Latin American books. His gifts to the JCB were extensive, and his impact was profound. Before I turn the mic over to my colleague, Jose Montelongo, I want to encourage those of you here with us in person to take a few moments to join us for a reception after the event. And we're so pleased, again, that you've chosen to join us this evening for what will undoubtedly be a very compelling lecture. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Jose Montelongo, the Maury Bromsen Curator of Latin American Books.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm super excited because I'm from Mexico City, because I am the Maury Bromsen Curator of books, of Latin American books. I would go as far as to say that I'm more excited than my 12-year-old daughter is about going this Sunday to watch Taylor Swift's movie in an IMAX. So this is our IMAX tonight. This is our Taylor Swift. Tatiana Seijas, our speaker this evening, has many friends on campus, and especially in this library, because she was a JCB long-term fellow in 2014-2015. She is currently Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, and before joining Rutgers, she was a professor at Penn State University and at Miami University. Before that, she obtained her PhD from Yale University. Instead of reading her long list of publications, let me tell you briefly about two of them. The first one is this, published by the Cambridge University Press, Asian Slaves in Colonial Mexico, From Chinos to Indians. And it was deemed by many of her peers a groundbreaking work in trans-Pacific studies. In the words of Matthew Restel, this book effectively shifts our views of Asian slavery in Spanish America, of identity terms like Chino, and indeed of race and ethnicity in early colonial Mexico. The second one is a collective volume titled As If She Were Free, which Tatiana edited along with Erica Ball and Terry Snyder. It is a book that brings together the biographies of 24 women of African descent to reveal how enslaved and recently freed women sought, imagined, and found freedom from the 16th through the 19th century in the Americas. In an interview last year, Professor Seijas remarked that teachers have approached her to tell her how useful this book has been in the classroom, especially with undergraduate students, whether in courses about colonial Virginia or Peru or Brazil or Mexico, sometimes reading a few chapters, sometimes the entire book. Herself a researcher and a teacher, As If She Were Free is a book that has brought Professor Seijas this very particular satisfaction. I leave you now with Tatiana Seijas. At the end of her talk, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A, and people joining us remotely can send her questions, can just write them in the chat. Thank you. Thank you for being with us, Tatiana.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. As he told you, I was a JCB fellow back in 2014, and I count those months as among the most rewarding intellectual experiences of my academic life. I want to come back. It is an honor to share my research, which began for this project when I encountered this engraving of Mexico City in the JCB's collection. You know, this place inspires new histories. So, play a little music. It is choral music composed in America's first colonial metropolis. I want you to imagine living here in the 1600s today and invite you to think about the people who sustain our cities today. Okay. So this engraving is an aerial view of the cityscape from the 17th century. You can see the arched aqueduct in the middle register that delivered fresh water to its residents. You can make out the grid pattern streets. You can also, technical problems here. You can also, see big buildings like the Viceroyal Palace. But I also want you to focus on the people in the bottom register, working people. That's what I do. I try to recover the experiences of such individuals, figuratively bringing them into the city. And I do so to stress their contributions, their struggles, their co-creation of this space. Sources like this engraving encourage intimate encounters with people who'd otherwise fade from history. The title, American Metropolis, The Making of Mexico City, refers to them, residents who made Mexico City. So let us step into the city now ourselves to understand where we live and the people who we rely on. The pandemic showed all of us that we depend on essential workers. Living in New York City, I was awed by hospital workers and so very grateful for the people who sold me food at the supermarkets, kept the subway running. What would we do without those who do the hard work of caring, feeding, and transporting their neighbors? Yet their working conditions have not changed all that much since the pandemic. Take this article from the Times. It's about subway conductors who were fighting to be recognized and rewarded for their contributions back in May 2020. So I think about that and look to the past. This afternoon, I'm going to tell you 3 stories about market women, coachmen, and barbers who lived in Mexico City. They were essential workers, as we might think of them today. Like nurses and subway workers, they too fought to make their voices heard and may, remarkably, have been more successful in their negotiations with city officials, gaining concessions that we might find surprising. So this plan from the 1620s, this is the original. The engraving is based on this plan. It has no people. So you'll soon hear about the experiences of historical actors who bring it to life. We cannot understand the history of metropolitan areas without centering working people, and we have not done that enough. especially in a sustained, long-durée periodization that charts and articulates their particular contributions. So let's do it for Mexico City, a city in the middle of lakes, which by the 17th century was more than 300 years old, having once been Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Mexica, the Aztec Empire, and subsequently the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, a part of the Spanish Empire. It had changed. Still a city of empire, but now a center of global finance, international diplomacy, and home to diasporas from around the world. From Africa, America, Asia, and Europe, it seemed to be at the center of the world. It had become the most ethnically diverse city in the hemisphere, possibly in the world. Yet, indigenous people remained the majority of the population. And they, along with enslaved people of African and Asian descent, did the most taxing, difficult, and essential work. Today is October 12th, a day that celebrates indigenous resistance in Mexico. It's Día de la Resistencia Indígena. And we had Indigenous Peoples Day this past Monday. Not too long ago, as we all know, the day commemorated the so-called discovery of the New World and celebrated European colonization. It supported a vision of America represented in this JCB map. The hemisphere is all parceled out among European states. Indigenous Peoples Day flips this formulation. It asks that we think about America from the perspective of indigenous states and Native people who experienced and challenged colonialism. In this spirit, we acknowledge the Narragansett Indian tribe and their relationship to this land. Looking at Mexico City in the same manner, we move beyond seeing it as a conquered territory. Native people co-created a new city. They built relationships with people who moved to their homeland and found ways to manage living in a coercive context. Our first story, told next, is about indigenous women who did just that. So this painting from the 1670s captures market exchange. It's the main square, described by a contemporary as, quote, a most spacious space whither all people resort to buy, exchange, and sell. Looking closely at a detail from the bottom register, we see our historical actors. Indigenous market women are selling produce, some beneath canopies for shade. They are wearing traditional garb, huipiles, to proclaim their native identity. They, Nahua, Zapotec, Maya women gathered in front of the Viceroyal Palace, an area that was once the center of Tenochtitlan, to claim this commercial space for themselves. They were not part of an informal economy. These women pushed officials to accept them as legitimate economic actors, and they got licenses to occupy this space. Isabel Francisca, a Nahua woman, was part of a grassroots movement that created a central food complex that provisioned Mexico City. You could find everything in the combined space of the main square and the adjoining Volador Square, circled in red. All kinds of produce, prepared foods. There were fruit stands with pomegranates and figs and grapes, and avocados and guavas. Vendors sold pies filled with seasoned vegetables, which were, according to one resident, quote, the refuge of those who cannot cook, end quote, or, people in need of a snack. So Isabel guarded her spot in the main square, next to the Royal Canal. This rendering maybe allows you to see it a little bit better. Her spot was right along the aqueduct there. I'm sorry, the canal. So Isabel This graphic rendering of the detail gives you a sense of the space, right? Every day she'd arrive on a canoe from her home where she'd have prepared the main ingredient for her offerings, cacao. Once at her spot, right, Isabel would set up her pots, her ladles, her cups, and start selling sweet and savory drinks. Now, city ordinances dictated that indigenous people, vendors, could sell food freely and wherever they wanted. That's a quote. So one January morning in 1639, Isabel marched into the viceroyal palace when inspectors tried to dislodge her from the complex. She demanded protection and she got it. Royal officials confirmed that Isabel had every right to stay right where she was. She was feeding the city. We know because her petition to the General Indian Court survives in the National Archive. Isabel's actions exemplify those of other market women who empowered themselves by sustaining Mexico City. Our second story is about Coachmen. I show you this other painting to have you imagine some of the spaces where they worked and where they passed their leisure time. It's the Alameda, the central park of Mexico City. You see in the detail coachmen driving carriages, walking around, having picnics. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit more detail for those of you who can see. There you see the coachmen. I wish I could also zoom in and show you the carriage houses in some of the buildings in the upper register. In those carriage houses, that is where free and enslaved men came together in political action. It is no coincidence that, such places aren't the focus of this painting. Carriage houses were unimportant to patrons who commissioned paintings, even though it was due to people who lived there that wealthy residents moved around the city with such comfort. Carriage houses are important to us. Looking inside allows us to show that free and enslaved people strengthened their fraternal bonds based on their occupation, and they carved out their own spaces in Mexico City. The second story. Jacinto and Diego were part of a community of free and enslaved coachmen who gathered in the evenings after long driving days for entertainment and for freedom-claiming activism. They held nightly games, card games, naipes, welcoming coachmen, from the African and Asian diasporas that came together to spend time with one another. They would set up a table in their room located in the carriage house of a slave owner, and they welcomed their guests every night. Jacinto and Diego likely purchased an official deck of cards like this one to avoid being fined if caught playing with hand-painted cards. Jacinto and Diego, they would allow small wagers, to enliven their games. But it was also, the nightly games were a money-making venture. They were slowly saving for manumission to self-purchase. At the same time, they had to be careful on the betting front, to prevent players from becoming too indebted to each other, which threatened, their community's cohesion. Their room was a place that was part of a whole network of safe spaces maintained in carriage houses and stables across Mexico City. Coachmen created these havens in response to ordinances that sought to control the nightly movements of African and Asian descended people, be they free or enslaved. In August 1645, when Jacinto and Diego were hosting their games, the Viceroy of New Spain noted that residents ignored the prohibitions on gathering in groups, late in the evenings, which, this is the Viceroy, showed a lack of respect for Spaniards and ignored the differences between people, end quote. The Viceroy was thus acknowledging Coachmen's political engagement. Their meetings expressed their rejection of policies aimed at categorizing and denigrating people like themselves. Looking at the whole painting again, where we met our market women, we see coachmen who kept the city in motion, right? They made it possible for a doctor, to quickly reach the other side of the city, to treat a suffering patient. Coachmen also, took silver merchants to the House of Coins, which was located in the Viceroyal Palace. That is where pieces of 8, reals, were minted. Silver coins like this one that circulated as global currency. From Boston to Istanbul, people used these coins minted in Mexico City as money. So, more significantly to us, right, we have the global connections. But coachmen really sustained themselves. We were talking about sustaining a city. They sustained themselves. They created a community that transcended legal divides and ethnic differences. Coachmen mapped out an alternative geography of refuge, while also embedding themselves in formal geographies, working within the authorized spaces to make a living. Onwards to our third story. Alonso Lopez wrote a very influential treatise titled A Sum and Compilation on Surgery with a Course on Bleeding. Here is the title page from the JCB's copy. It covers topics such as the treatment of bone fractures, dental procedures, and phlebotomy. In the early modern period, that European tradition, barbers provided these medical services, along with shaving beards and, cutting and washing hair. Barber surgeons in Mexico City used Lopez's book to study for their medical board examinations, which were a requisite for getting licenses to work in the city. They learned, for instance, to use the thinnest of needles to suture wounds. So it was thrilling for me, right, to read this book here a while back, because it brought me into proximity, right, with the hands of people who did this work. At the same time, it got me thinking about people who may have been cautious about bleeding, which was done with these instruments, a lancet and a collecting bowl. Looking at archival documents later on, I realized that this was indeed the case. Starting in the 1610s, residents had the option of turning to barbers who took a more holistic approach, disdaining the practice of bloodletting. They are the historical actors of the third story. Silvestre Vicente was among the pioneers who created a new form of barbering, focused on cosmetic and therapeutic services. These innovators, like Vicente, were from the Philippines, or they descended from enslaved people who had endured the Trans-Pacific Passage. They claimed their businesses, which they called blade and scissor shops. That's what they called them, And by the mid-1630s, they had a presence throughout the city, right? They had set up stalls at outdoor gathering spots. They opened storefronts on busy streets. Vicente had a shop near the Royal Hospital, circled in red, where he trained enslaved men to impart skills that could one day serve as a pathway to freedom. He taught them to listen to their customer stories, to promote the benefits of hygiene, and to help customers feel good about their appearance. Blade and scissor shops also, they provided massages and they served medicinal drinks. Residents lined up. They were eager to go to these shops, to spend time in salons that were clean and did not smell of blood, like traditional barber shops. So perhaps unsurprisingly, members of the Barbers and Surgeons Guild, men who called themselves Spaniards, grew resentful of their success, and they tried to shut them down. They used derogatory words to describe their competitors, which reveals the racial antagonism that fueled their complaints, apart from the real financial competition. Vicente and his colleagues successfully fought them at court. As in the case of Nahua market women, royal officials supported their businesses. The blade and scissor shops stayed open. The people who ostensibly ran the city, in other words, recognized that these new barbers were providing essential services. They cared for the city. Another incredible painting from the end of the surgery. It's the city's main square and the Bolador. You see the market. And I've circled some of our historical actors. Market women are sitting behind piles of green fruit at their stands with palm-thatched roofs. Their businesses appear as they're like neat rows organized around the fountain. A coachman is off back to his carriage house. There's a barber somewhere working at his blade and scissors stand. The stories of Isabel, Jacinto, Diego, and Vicente show us that indigenous and enslaved people built their own metropolis. They inscribed the squares, buildings, and streets with their own meanings. Now the figures here, they're very small. So I'm having us zoom in closer to see them and support and suggest that these people are the same as those who sustain cities today. The lecture blurb, for those of you who read it, mentioned that visitors, they were always noting the city's grand buildings, its, grid pattern streets. They loved going to the Alameda. It's all here, painted on a folding screen. I hope that you can now visualize, right, at least some of the working people who lived here. That you can see inside the buildings, onto the squares, to see them sustaining the city. We need histories that people this type of depiction, that show how they made and transformed cities. America's first colonial metropolis, and all the other cities of this hemisphere were made by and are maintained today by working people. Cities are not, obviously, elite creations. Think of New York, Lima, Rio de Janeiro, LA. The passing of 400 years, it's changed city life, yet there are echoes in the past. Today, residents of Mexico City and these other cities make a living in remarkably similar ways. Stories from 17th-century Mexico City illustrate, right, these commonalities, and I wrote the talk to plot this out. Indigenous market women from the 17th century, like Isabel, would have recognized the struggles of these vendors in New York City. They are immigrants. They speak Spanish and various indigenous languages. They are native people and members of diasporic communities. And as this Times article indicates, they have taken to the streets, right, to tell City Hall that they will not be regulated out of the picture. They need licenses to join the formal economy, to protect themselves from police raids. Stop undervaluing our work, right? Immigrant labor, that's what they're saying. Perhaps the mayor could take note of the official line of viceroys of Mexico City, people who feed us deserve our support. People who move to cities, back to the original engraving, they follow the gravitational pull of opportunity, right? Others are pushed by environmental and military displacement. What happens once they're there? According to one early modern philosopher, they flourished. People flourished in cities. He wrote, "Cities are an assembly of people whose everyday experiences are easier, more plentiful, profitable, and generally more pleasurable because they live together in built, spaces." He was a fan, right, of cities. Others might disagree, emphasizing the poverty and inequality of cities that diminish people's lives. The history of 17th century Mexico City, I suggest, allows for both perspectives, right? Showing that even its most dispossessed residents, colonized indigenous people, and enslaved people, forced migrants, claimed urban space for their own purposes. Let us take note. To strengthen our solidarity towards immigrants who are arriving every day in cities such as New York and Chicago, Mexico City, our cities can surely gain from their contributions, as Mexico did in the past. Thank you. So it will be my pleasure to hear your comments, if you have questions. They volunteered, to organize, but I can, raise your hand. And the only thing is that you have to use the microphone because otherwise our friends on Zoom can't hear us, right? That's why I'm also going to be standing here. Otherwise, I'd be like jumping around over there, getting excited about history. So, yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So you talked about how there was an empire, there was a lot of coercion in Mexico City before the 17th century. Can you talk about, is there any evidence do we have before the Spaniards about the efforts of ordinary people in the city before the Spaniards came?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. So, there's been so much fascinating work by scholars who are studying, the Nahua peoples from a completely different perspective, right? That are reading Nahua documentation in other indigenous languages that are recovering, this past. Indigenous people wrote their histories, once they adopted our alphabet. And so we do know a lot about kind of the economic realities of living in another capital, city of empire. And, as in most cities at this time, there were people who were enslaved, who were forced to work. So that's what I mean by the coercion. But I was specifically talking about in the 17th century, right, the topic of my book. You have to recognize it, grapple with it. Indigenous people, residents, they had to, do labor drafts to, build that aqueduct. So that's what I was talking about too. But thank you for that question.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk and for this call to action, for solidarity, and also for just illustrating this beautiful presentation. I'm an art historian, so this has been wonderful to see the images.
Good. My art historian friends are they're my inspiration.
Oh, thank you. So I am not a historian or a Marxist expert by any means, but I was really drawn to this notion of work and the capacious ways that work is functioning here. So I was wondering if you could talk more about how you see work functioning specifically in relationship to gender and race. So for instance, in the marketplace, you have the women who are defending their right to sell, which sustains the city, but then simultaneously sustains themselves, right?
Their
and their
families, yeah.
ability to, for social reproduction, in a sense, right? And to sustain their own families. And even for the Coachmen, their work kind of functions differently in the sense that, as you beautifully said, you know, they create these new geographies of resistance, but then the fact that they're being painted is also, they have this work of symbolizing wealth, right? Of this kind of extension of wealth of another person or another group of people. And so I was just wondering, if you could speak more to the different ways you see work functioning, or maybe what this case study can help us rethink of in terms of work.
Right. It's a wonderful common question. So you caught me that these are my obsessions as I try to complete the final revisions. So I have been thinking a lot about the kind of the male spaces that were created by these enslaved and free men in these carriage houses. I take very seriously where gender studies has gone to acknowledge, right, the construction of both all of our people. And so I've been thinking a lot about that and how difficult it is to recover those male spaces and why that was necessary at this point, right? In some ways, enslaved men who were coachmen had this incredible mobility, right? That was probably not true of some of the enslaved women who lived in the same households, right? Who may have gone to the market, but they did not have this kind of like view of the city, right? And so I wonder what it means that they, after being in, in the city, kind of doing their, performative work, as you called it, what it meant for them to go back to spaces that were really kind of like fraternal male spaces, and how that must have given them strength, right, to be able to, deal with living in a place where there was so much inequality. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And in terms of, the market women, yes, absolutely, right? They are, Isabel was getting up at, 3 a.m. to, grind cacao and going to this place. And yes, it's market women primarily who make this complex, right? It is women who are there, they're fighting the viceroy. They're like, because they kept wanting to clear the center of the city. And they were like, we are staying, right? We pay rent. So I think that's another, I think in terms of like the work aspect, why does, it's like the forever question for gender studies, why does certain work end up being done by, men and women? So I think I'm gonna have to keep thinking about that. I welcome all of your emails and comments as I'm writing the conclusion, because I'd like to bring that in again. Because obviously right now the book is like, there's a chapter on market women, there's a chapter on coachmen, there's also carters are also part of that chapter. And then there's the chapter on barbers, and then the final one is on silversmiths. Also very, it's like the very official guild male space. So yeah, by all, I will definitely continue thinking about that. Thank you. Yes, please. Oh, okay.
Tatiana, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have a question from our remote audience. It says, hello Tatiana, it's Sally Hayes. Thank you for a beautiful talk. I have a question about your relationship with the archive. Archival documents from the period and context often center conflict. And I like how you use them here to foreground stories of peace and cooperation, even though they enter the archive because of conflict. Can you talk us through your strategies for doing this? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I'm obsessed with the archive. I think many of us are historians here. We think about it all the time, colonial constructions, and yet so rich. What would we do without archives? can't write history. I think in the case of the Spanish Empire, there is so much more documentation than for people who study like the British Caribbean, for example, that we almost have too much documentation, right? Like how do you theorize and work through like a gazillion documents that I will never in my whole life be able to read? So in terms of, yes, in terms of legal records, I would agree that oftentimes it is the documentation centers conflict. But most of my work, I read a lot of property records, and they're not about conflict at all. They're about people like, becoming an apprentice. They're about people who are writing their will. There are people who are selling a mule. And so that's where you really see transactions, right? And how do you bring transactions to life? Well, you try to find the people who are doing these transactions. So it's a combination of using a variety of sources, right? I use legal records. We have so many courts, the Inquisition, the High Court. And then I use, like accounting books. And so, combining them is how you can get at people, and that really has been kind of like, it's my intellectual agenda, I would say, to really write the experience of people, try to get into their mind, try to understand how they made history, chart time. We historians, we chart change over time, and I like to do it following the steps of people. So I think he had a question.
So thank you for a wonderful presentation this evening. Absolutely engaging, and was very interested actually in the first book that was held up, your original on all of the different populations within Mexico. And I actually wanted to come back to that in terms of your research. Mm-hmm. In terms of the records that you were looking at, were the Spanish officials differentiating in the way that they treated the different populations within the city? Was it the Navajo population in sort of one way, the enslaved African population in another way, the Asian population in another way? I mean, were they making those distinctions, and how was that reflected?
That's a great question. In terms of the categorization, I kind of referenced that when I was talking about the coachmen in their carriage houses. So I would say that the biggest divide in terms of how people were categorized is there are free people and there are enslaved people. And so that is supported by a whole legal apparatus, right, that makes it possible for slave societies to continue. So I would say that from the perspective of officials, that's the more of the categorization. There's this other, maybe a little bit older historiography that talked about people who were being categorized by ethnicity, right? And so that's something that we need to consider. I think that maybe is something that happens more in the 18th century. I think in the 17th, those kind of racial categories are kind of coming into being. I think because it's such an international space, there are enslaved people who are, from like what is now New Mexico here, right? There are people from Angola and Mozambique and Goa. Right? Everybody's living here together. So that kind of like racial categorization that we see later on, right? When in the Americas, slavery becomes like black and white. That doesn't happen here until the end of the century. And that does become something that is more of a categorization. And then in terms of indigenous people, the Spanish Empire ran with kind of like a double view. There were people who were indigenous, and there were certain laws that only applied to them. And then there's other group of people, everybody else. So it was, the way that the legal and bureaucratic apparatus that was built in the Spanish Empire, there was that grave distinction. There are native people, and then there's everybody else. And in some ways, it was done as, to protect indigenous people's property rights. It's a very different context like that in the British Empire. It's a good question. Thank you.
Tatiana, thank you so much for this question, and for this lecture. Is this on? Yeah?
I think so.
Because it sounds good. Okay.
You have to be like me, be like, whoa.
Yeah, it's like, whoa, right, exactly. Where is this working? Anyway, Tatiana, thank you so much for this lecture. Super interesting. It seems unfair to ask you about something that you didn't talk about, except that I know how much in that wonderful book with Terry and Erica, you do deal with this essential category of labor, which is childcare. So I wonder the extent to which this very essential work, which is essentially gendered in this period as now, weaves through those chapters and through your thinking about market women, and families.
Yes, I've thought a lot about that, especially because, it was like that project, As If She Were Free. It was like, such a passion project for all of us women coming together to write these histories. So the work of production is something that I think about a lot, right? Enslaved women, their labor was reproductive, right? Reproductive of a slave system, right? So I think a lot about that in terms of how people were so strategic about marrying for African and Asian descended men. A lot of times they ended up marrying Native women, because Native women did not have, they had a free womb, right? And how much for families, like the focus became saving for manumission for the mother, right? Or for the aunt, because the point was to get that person, right, that body out of the system of enslavement. So that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. In terms of, I have this chapter on silversmiths because I wanted to explain the silver economy. It's like a city of silver, Mexico City was. And I've been trying to recover a little bit the work of the partners of silversmiths, right? And their strategic investments, which were about being able to pass on wealth to all of their children, right? So there's once you create children, you take care of children, but there's like, as you know, this sustained lifelong effort, right, to support your children. And oftentimes, in the testaments, they're like, I have worked so that, my children will not need to work, right? That kind of phrasing, you catch women's work in terms of investment, right? Women, of course, in the Spanish Empire could own property once they had signed a legal document at marriage that enabled them to keep control over their property, which is very different than the British Empire. Can't even imagine that in the British Empire. And so that's one of the ways I've been thinking about it. But I'm working on this other book that is, it's the story of a woman from what is now Sierra Leone. Her name is Antona. And I'm trying to kind of write her biography with only very little documentation, inspired, of course, by the work of my fabulous colleague, Marisa Fuentes. So I've been thinking, so that kind of working on that biography and then also trying to finish this book has my mind kind of really going more into that headspace, right? Reconsidering the reproductive, the caring lives of women. But it's not as apparent at all. This is more about, it's kind of like, it's economic history, but with so many stories that people won't think it's not interesting, right? Sometimes economic history can be a little, I'm an economic historian, so yeah.
So here's another question from our remote audience. Hello, Tatiana. Rafaela Acevedo Field here. In the final manuscript, will you deal with the geography of the center of the city and how these different groups interacted with the different spaces. You touched on it when you talked about the painting, but can you elaborate on it? Thank you.
Great. Yeah, that's a very good question. We want to do so much, right, in our work, in writing histories. I've thought a lot about that because, but the decisions I made in terms of organizing this book, it is very much by occupation, right? So that makes it so that you're talking about people doing one work, and then in the chapter is a different work, and then do they ever cross paths, right? So I've been working really hard at that, trying to bring people back that I've introduced in another chapter to show, for example, that the market women, they relied on the work of carters. So when I'm when you're in the carter section in the transportation chapter, I try to make those connections to see how all of these people working in their own occupations, doing their different thing, carrying, transporting, right, the city, they were all relying on each other, right? So that's where I see that, the interactions. And that's why the painting, like the one that I showed you, right, this one, is just so evocative, right? Because here is all the work, right? It's the center, it's the heart of the city. But the complexity is trying to make these people come alive with a documentation that survives, right? And of course they're talking, they're getting married, they're fighting each other. That doesn't show up so much in the documentation, right? So, in some ways, you have to, I don't know, it's not imaginative leaps, because it's all very informed by what you know about places. But I think that now that I'm older, I am more comfortable making, trying to contextualize people's lives in a way that is not just, based on the document. So.
Thank you, Tatiana, so much for your presentation. I was thinking that in public festivities, in public celebrations, maybe it's one of those places where some of the people you've talked about, their work comes together, even though during the actual festivity, and I'm thinking the arrival of viceroys or the funeral celebrations when a king or queen dies in Spain. And during the day, during the procession, you see the important people in the city, the important people politically, academically, religiously.
But people are on the streets too, right?
Yes,
Right.
yes. My question is, where do you see in those festivities the hidden work of the people you are more interested in for your book?
Okay, that's a really good question. We do have a rich literature because there were so many poems and books written describing these great festivities. There were a lot of festivities that happened annually in the city, and one of the really big ones was Corpus Christi, the procession for Corpus Christi. So the barbers that I mentioned, right, the new barbers, they, of course, couldn't join the guild, so they formed their own confraternity, their own brotherhood. And brotherhoods, these confraternities in the city, did get a chance to participate in the processions, right? So people spent, they spent a lot of money because people, to belong to a religious brotherhood, you pay in, and it also kind of enables for you to have a funeral at the end, right? Your confraternity pays for the funeral. But a lot of the money that was given, to the coffers of the confraternity was to buy the biggest candles, to buy the biggest banners, right? To get new capes for everybody, because people wanted to be in the procession as opposed to only viewing the procession of power, right? So maybe that's in this kind of religious context, people are being I am walking, right? Yes, the viceroy walked before me. Yes, all the university professors, but our little brotherhood, We're poor. The procession we're marching towards the back, but we are here. So I think that's where I see people valuing that kind of performative action, right? Being on the streets, along with the most powerful people in the city. Yeah. And also waving to their friends. I mean, right? Like you have to kind of really, I don't know. I think a lot about what it must have been like. And it's so easy for me to think about what it's like because I live in a city, right? I mean, I totally see the daily interactions and the inscribing of space, the way that people, figure out where they fit and how they can be seen. So, it's the 1600s. People are, being human, doing the things that we do. Absolutely. It's a good question. Thank you. Yeah, please. Oh, yeah, the microphone.
You can answer this very as long or as short as you like, but I had a question about the connection between work or kinds of work and race. I'm also an art historian. I very much appreciate all the visuals, and I worked on Costa painting, which is more of the
18th century.
And I was really surprised to see how fluid racial categories were back then. Like, you would your race didn't really define who you were. It was like more what you wore, what you ate, what you did. That defined you as Indio or as African or Black. Do you find that in your research of work?
So, that kind of grouping of paintings, they're called the casta paintings. They are very definitely from the mid 1700s. It's a different world, and as I think people have shown, it is not reality, right? The paintings are models, people who wanted to categorize, and people had these paintings made to show their categories. That is not how people lived, right? People did not identify with horribly derogatory words, right, that are like imprinted on the casta paintings. People lived their life. They were going to the market. They were dressing as they wanted. And so, yeah, it's a very kind of different setting in terms of, but also as I was saying before, that kind of like the racializations, it's such an 18th century thing that then of course continues into the 19th, and we are here today. But I think we're talking about a slightly different world. And, frankly, I'm a historian. I show you because it inspires me to look at paintings. But, I use paintings from a different analytical angle, than what, my very capable art historians friends can do. They see things that I don't see. So, yes, thank you for that question.
Thanking Tatiana for this wonderful event.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry you didn't end on the previous question where you said just being human, just people being human, which was a great ending. Anyway, but thank you so much, Tatiana. And now we'd like to invite you to join us for reception, and thank you again to our friends who are joining us remotely.
Yeah, hello, everybody on the internet.
Hello and goodbye, right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all of those people who were on Zoom. Thank you.